Good day, this is SS2 Public Sector Accounting. I'll be taking you through study section 2, Public and Private Sector. When you have studied this section, you should be able to explain public sector and outline the objectives and significance of public sector. You should be able to explain private sector and outline the objectives and characteristics of private sector. And lastly, you should be able to discuss public-private partnership and its benefits. Public sector is the part of the economy that is concerned with providing basic government services. The composition of the public sector varies by country, but in most countries, the public sector includes such services as the police, military, public roads, public transit, primary education, and health care for the poor. The public sector provides services that non-payer cannot be excluded from, such as street lighting. Services which benefit all of society rather than just the individual who uses the service, such as public education and services that encourage equal opportunity. So we can define public sector as that part of the economy that is concerned with the providing of basic government services. Let's continue as we learn the objectives of public sector. The objectives of public sector in a nation is to, number one, accelerate the individual growth and development of the economy, to build up a strong infrastructure for supporting economic growth and the development of the country, to provide competition to the private sector for welfare of the state and the public at large, to generate employment and strive for removal of poverty, to make investments in order to fill the gap between savings and investment, to promote balanced and comprehensive economic growth of the economy of the country, to make investment in those areas where the private sector is not willing to invest, to promote the development of small and ancillary industries, to focus on increasing export of the country for earning foreign exchange, and also to enter sectors where imports can be substituted by products made in other nations. So these are some of the objectives of public sector. What about the problems of public sector and the problem in interference and corruption, obsolete technology, and overcapitalization? These are some of the problems, some of the challenges of public sector. Let's talk about private sector. The private sector is usually composed of organizations that are privately owned and not part of the government. This usually includes corporations, both profit and non-profit, partnerships, and charities. An easier way to think of the private sector is by thinking of organizations that are not owned or operated by the government. For example, retail stores, credit unions, and local businesses will operate in private sectors. So we can say that private sector refers to the part of the economy that is usually composed of organizations that are owned by individuals or groups for profit making and not controlled by government. What are the characteristics of private sector? The main motive of private sector undertakings is to earn profit, and the main characteristics will be explained under private ownership and control, profit motive, no state participation, private finance, and independent management. But let us first of all explain that of private ownership and control. A private sector undertaking is fully owned and controlled by the private entrepreneurs. It may be owned by one individual or a group of individuals jointly. When owned by one person, it is called sole proprietorship. A group of persons may jointly own the firm in the form of joint stock company, for example, or cooperative society. Let's talk about profit motive. The main objective of private sector undertakings is to earn profits. Profit provides a reward for the risk assumed and the required return on capital. Let's talk about the third on the list, which is no state participation. There's any participation by the central or state government in the ownership and control of a private sector undertaking. So there's no state participation where the private sector is concerned. What about private finance? The capital of a private sector undertaking is arranged by its owners. The sole trader contributes the capital of a sole proprietorship. In case of partnership, capital is invested by the partners. A joint stock company raises capital by the issue of shares and debentures. A private sector undertaking can also raise loans to meet its long-term and short-term needs for fund. Let's talk about independent management. A private sector undertaking is managed by its owners. In case of sole proprietorship and partnership, the owners directly manage the firm. The management of a joint stock company lies in the hands of directors who are the elected representatives of the shareholders. So these are some of the characteristics of private sector. Let's move on as we talk about the significance of private sector. The private sector can be an important player in community development. Apart from creating jobs, companies can also provide healthcare, clean drinking water, and education facilities in the countries where they operate. Given their wide outreach, companies can provide excellent advocacy and communication support to social, environmental, and cultural changes. The activities of small and mid-sized enterprises have cumulative effect on sustainability. Unlike corporations, they rely on NGOs and other entities to offer low-cost professional development. The private sector can also contribute to mitigating environmental challenges by factoring environmental concerns into their business operations. So these are some of the significance of private sector. What are the problems of private sector? The challenges of private sector. The private sector is no doubt a major actor in creating economic opportunities for impoverished communities. It generates employment, creates innovation, and produces revenue for various sectors of society. But we must note that not all investments reduce poverty or address growing inequalities. For instance, many corporate bodies and bilateral institutions are yet to adopt the UN Declaration on the Right of Indigenous Peoples, or to recognize those people's inheritance right to free, prior, or informed consent to extractive operations in indigenous lands and territories. And we are going to let us explain the problems of private sector under these three areas, which are certain public-private priorities, a low human rights standard, and lack of private sector and development effective principles. But let us first of all talk about settling public-private priorities. In the case of public-private partnerships, focus on profit over public services can distort national development priorities. Many countries, including Mexico, India, and Bangladesh, are promoting the PPPs, which is the public-private partnerships, in their policy frameworks, seeing such deals as facilitating greater economic infrastructure investment. Public-private partnerships target infrastructure such as transport over more important social concerns such as health and education. Private corporations favor constructing roads, railways, ports, and electricity lines because of the profit-making user fees that can generate in addition to profit from construction. The second problem of private sector under low human rights standard. Let's talk about that. The private sector can take a more effective development role by improving compliance with human rights standards. Issues with business involvement across the nation where private sector is practiced usually include exclusive decision making, prioritization, misinformation, limited public gains, lack of accountability, among others. Multiple challenges persist for private sector involvement in development. The key to overcoming them lies in incorporating human rights commitments, regulatory frameworks, and democratic ownership. Let's talk about lack of private sector and development effective principles. Development of effective principles must be integrated into national development framework in order for the private sector to adhere to them. Private sector participation must therefore keep pace with progressing development and human rights standards, but many donors and institutions have not sufficiently incorporated human rights development effectiveness principles and other international standards into private sector strategies. Let's move on as we talk about the major differences between the public sector and the private organization. Major differences between public and private organization. The question of differences and similarities between public and private sectors has been long a classic topic among fields like management and organizational theory. It has been said that public and private management are alike in an unimportant respect, while when it comes to important aspects, the two are actually quite different from each other. The major differences are the private sector are primarily concerned with making a profit, while the public is more concerned with delivering services or regulating individual or group behavior in public interest. But let's talk about some other differences between the public and private sector organization. Number one, public sector is usually composed of organizations that are owned and operated by the government, while private sector while private sector is usually composed of organizations that are privately owned and not part of the government. Secondly, public sector includes federal, provincial, state, municipal government, depending on where you live. Private legislation usually calls organization in the public sector a public body or a public authority, while in private sector they are usually this usually includes corporations, both profit and non-profit, partnership and charities. So these are some of the major differences between the public and the private organization. Let's move on as we talk about the definition of public-private partnership. A public-private partnership, known as PPP, is a government service or private business venture which is funded and operated through a partnership of government and one or more private sector companies. These schemes are sometimes referred to as PPP or P3. So sometimes when you see PPP, what they are talking about is public-private partnership. Public-private partnership can be defined as an agreement which exists between governments and one or more private partnership, according to which the private partners deliver the service in such a manner that the service delivery objectives of the government are aligned with the profit objectives of the private partners, where the effectiveness of the alignment depends on a sufficient transfer of risk to the partners. Let's move on as we talk about the benefits of public-private partnership. Public-private partnerships are gaining traction because they have the potential to offer numerous benefits over conventional procurement. The following are the benefits of public-private partnership. Number one, better performance in the construction phase through delivery on time and on budget. Number 2, greater value of money expected over project life cycle. Number 3, improvement in customer service. Number 4, increased scope for innovation of infrastructure delivery. And lastly, improved care of public asset. So these are some of the benefits of public-private partnership. I hope you have learned one or two things in this study section, and I hope that you will continue to learn more as you go through other study sections. Thanks for listening.